Welcome back to Lost in Translation. This week, we're going to do a quick recap of some information that we didn't really get to go into great detail on last week about William Adams. I think you guys are really going to like it. So, the number one thing I wanted to talk about was some of the more specific, crazy things that happened on the voyage from Europe to Japan. When I first read about this, I figured, okay, he probably went from Europe down around Africa, up past India, and on to Japan that way. That is not the case. He cut across the Atlantic and he cut across the Pacific, and it's completely insane that he made it there at all. Now, obviously, we see that a bunch of ships did not make it, and so it's clear that it was a super treacherous journey. But I want to go over some of the specific stories of things that happened. So first off, William was married. He had a wife in England and kids. And so the crazy thing is he left them behind, and I'm sure he thought that he would see them again. But obviously, as we know, he never saw them again. In fact, he didn't only not see them again, but he went to Japan, married another wife, and had 2 kids with that wife. On top of that, William appeared to have been, he kind of got around. He apparently had at least one other mistress in Japan that we know of. The great thing, though, is by the time William actually started writing letters home from Japan, once the trade had picked up with England and the Dutch, he actually sent some money home to his wife and family back in England to support them, because obviously, as we know in Japan, he became fairly well off. So he was a responsible person. He still tried to help them out, even if he never, ever went back to England personally. So William, most of what we know about him really comes from these letters that he wrote from Japan that we have. Quite a few of them are still surviving. The funny thing is there's some variations of a few of the letters that he wrote. So some will contain a little information on this, some will contain a little information on that, even though the basic outline of the letters was roughly the same. So William was actually the pilot for one of the ships in this expedition. And in this case, a pilot is somebody who's actually responsible for maneuvering a ship in tighter waters, like close quarters, more dangerous situations, as well as being somewhat responsible for navigation. Usually pilots are supposed to be extremely familiar with the waters that the ship is traveling through. Nowadays, pilots are still a thing. They're generally the people who will take a ship that comes into a harbor, into a dock, like a giant freighter whose stopping distance, is measured in miles, where if you hit the brakes, you're not going to stop for a couple miles. You need to know where you're going if you're going to run aground, if there's a shallower area you should be avoiding. So nowadays, pilots are still a thing. But William Adams, in this case, he was a pilot, but they were going places that he'd never been before, which is especially tough when it's your responsibility to make sure that you don't crash. Now, that became a particular problem through the Strait of Magellan, which we'll get to in a second here. So there's a correction I have to make. In the video, I said that they left Rotterdam. They did not leave from Rotterdam. They left from a place called Texel, Texel, and which was a very common harbor at the time. For the Dutch. They left with 5 ships, and the admiral, his name was James Mahu. So the whole voyage is really attributed to him. It's easy to read this and think that William Adams was in charge of the whole thing. He was not. He was somewhat important, but he wasn't even one of the captains of any of the ships. And it's interesting because in his letters, he continually kind of... you could see that he was questioning the decision-making of some of the captains. There's a few moments where they decided to go this way or that way, and you can tell that William Adams, he was not always on the same page with the leadership of the expedition. So pretty early on, the expedition ran into some serious problems. In August of 1598, now remember they left in June, so this is not that far in. In August, the admiral, James Mahu, died of a fever near an island called Santiago, which is in the Cape Verde area. This was obviously a problem. He was the leader of the whole expedition, so they had to elect a new leader, kind of decide where they were going to go from there. Now, the funny thing is, the only reason they were in Santiago to begin with is because one of the captains had convinced the admiral that they would find what they call great refreshing there. He was convinced that there would be tons of goats and all kinds of great food and everything for them to load up on. So they stopped there, and they actually spent 24 days on this island hanging out. They didn't find anything, obviously. I don't know what happened to that captain who thought they would find stuff there, especially because some people died because of this poor decision making. But After 24 days, they decided, you know what, let's get the heck out of here. And they moved on towards actually Africa, like the continent of Africa. Now, William writes about something really funny that happened around this point in time. He said that him and the other pilots participated in a leadership council with the captains, and the pilots all stated how much they disliked that they were in Santiago, they disliked the area, and they were never invited to another leadership council again after that point, which is interesting. Basically, I don't agree with you, we're not going to ask your opinion again. So, too bad for William. But, you know, in the end, he's the one who made it out alive, so. So really, the admiral died shortly after they left Santiago, but he got the fever, and a lot of the mates on the voyage were already suffering from scurvy, which was a huge problem. So November 1598, one of the ships actually had 70 people on board that were sick. All the other ships had roughly 30 to 40 people who were sick. These ships are ships where it's like, I don't know, you might have 100 crew members. And so that's like, you're talking about almost half your crew or more than half your crew being sick. And that's a huge problem. So they decided, we've got to do something about this. So they ended up landing at a place on November 9th called Cape Lopez in Central Africa. Now, there's some crazy stuff that went down here, and I can't go into everything that happened, but ultimately they made a camp on the shore so that they could bring their sick men aboard or to land, so that they didn't have to be aboard the ship anymore and potentially get worse. Here they were going to be able to access fruits and vegetables and other things to help stave off scurvy, get some meat and some protein into their system. So they ended up running across like a local African king, and they actually traded with this African king. There's some stories of a few interactions that they had with them, and it's really funny. It's obvious that they just didn't get each other at all culturally. They ended up coming away from that interaction with only some like bananas and a few chickens, which when you're talking about hundreds of men, that's basically a complete loss. So they left Cape Gonzales on December 18th. They stayed there for quite a while, and they finally decided, you know what, this is not cutting it. We're going to get out of here. And they headed for an island called Anabon. So December 1598, Anabon Island, they actually reached it on December 9th. So it's basically just the next day. It was not that far. But there were so many men, again, that had scurvy. They're like, we have to stop here. So they brought other men to land again. But here they ran into the Portuguese and some local natives. The Portuguese were armed with weapons and did not want them there. So initially they had this little interaction where they said, hey, the only reason we're here is to get some supplies to deal with the scurvy, deal with these sick men. If you could help us out, that would be great. The Portuguese said, yeah, sure, fine. Come back later at night. We'll have some supplies for you. You can take those and just be on your way. Well, that's not what ended up happening. When the Dutch showed up to see if those supplies were there, they obviously weren't. Not only that, but the Portuguese were there again with their guns, basically saying, GTFO, we don't want you on our island. So the men who had landed ashore on these smaller sloops, they call them, they ended up heading back, and they reported to the admiral, and they told the admiral what had gone down. So the admiral, he was pretty upset. So he ordered all of his men to load up with their weapons, to hop on some sloops, and everyone was going to go ashore, and they were going to teach the Portuguese a lesson here. As soon as the Portuguese saw all of these ships coming to their shore, and they realized, like, okay, screw this, they lit all their huts on fire along the beach with their supplies and anything they had, and they kind of like ran for the hills a little bit. They withdrew kind of back into the woods. So naturally, the two sides, they started shooting at each other and just kind of going back and forth. A few men tried to go pick some fruit that they saw, because, I mean, they're hungry and sick, and the Portuguese would pick off anybody who got close enough to pick some fruit in the forest there. So the Dutch decided they needed to consolidate, needed to figure things out. So they brought a bunch of their sick ashore so that they could at least be there while they dealt with the Portuguese with their guns. They actually erected a gallows here as a warning to the Portuguese, like, if we catch you, we're going to hang you on this thing right here. So over the next few days, the Portuguese kind of kept raiding the Dutch camp right there on the shore. They go back and forth, kind of antagonizing them over and over. Ultimately, on Christmas Eve, December 24th, 150 men from the Dutch fleet decided, you know what, this ends now. We're storming the mountain that the Portuguese were kind of holed up on. Well, for some crazy reason, the Portuguese were prepared for this. They had giant boulders. They started rolling down this steep mountain as these Dutch were trying to work their ways up the mountain. And at least one person was crushed by one of these boulders, and other people were wounded. That was enough to break the spirits of the Dutch. They were like, okay, screw this. They're actually killing us now. We're just going to pull back. So the Dutch ended up running across some of the supplies that the Portuguese had left kind of hidden in some bushes, a bunch of biscuits and that sort of thing. They took a ton of that and lit all the rest of the buildings on fire that the Portuguese hadn't already lit on fire themselves. By this point, with all the fighting and the sickness, a bunch of men had died. So the Dutch ended up burying a lot of their men that had died there on the shore. They rounded up everyone who was still sick, still hadn't gotten better after even this long. They brought them back on the ships. And this time they set sail. They decided we're heading for the Strait of Magellan. They had at least a supply of fresh water, a ton of coconuts, and a ton of oranges. But as we'd find out later, that wasn't going to be enough. So, as we mentioned in the video, they ended up eating strands of rope leather and kind of doing anything that they had to survive during this rough stretch. The rations were cut back very, very strictly, and some men were so sick that they had these appetites that they couldn't control. So people started stealing food from the cook, from the pantry, which on a voyage like this was an absolute criminal offense. There was at least one guy who they ended up hanging because he had stolen some bread. That's how serious the condition was. Anyone taking more food than they needed would be killed. So things weren't looking great. They finally reached the Strait of Magellan, April 1599. So they've almost been gone for an entire year at this point, and they're just now reaching the Strait of Magellan. Unfortunately, here at the Strait of Magellan, as we talk about in the video, they ended up spending the entire winter there, which obviously, being the southern hemisphere, wintertime was going to be through what in the northern hemisphere they would have considered to be summer months. Throughout this time period, 120 men would die and be buried there. So more recently, in 1998, a Dutch university decided, you know what, we should be able to find some remnants of their stay in the Strait of Magellan. If that many people died and were buried, we should be able to find them, right? And so they determined what bay they actually stayed in, and they actually sent an archaeological expedition. And guess what? They found nothing, not a single thing. So what we know from that is either they got the location wrong, which seems kind of improbable, or what the expedition themselves concluded was that the soil was so boggy and acidic that they believed that the bodies actually completely broke down and disintegrated. Now, this is supported by the journals of Charles Darwin. When he went through the Strait of Magellan, he mentioned basically how there were some people, some graves and things that they ran across, and all that was left was like one bone and like a tooth because the soil was so acidic, it just broke everything down. Now, one of the main reasons they did not die while they were there is because of a place called Penguin Island. It's a place you can still go today as a tourist. It's just loaded with penguins. There's no natural features of any kind like trees, or it's just a barren island covered in penguins. And they ended up hunting initially 1,300 to 1,400 penguins that they were living off of. And some of the other ships, as they would later end up turning around and heading back to the Atlantic, killed even more penguins themselves. All told, they killed something like 5,000 penguins to survive here, which is completely nuts. Also, something crazy to note, apparently they ran into some natives who were 10 to 11 feet tall that they fought on occasion. I would chalk this up entirely to a tall tale similar to seeing a mermaid or something like that. It's not unusual for these kinds of voyages with starving and exhausted men to think that they've seen something more fantastical than they really did. So finally the winds shifted and they decided it was time to get out of the Strait of Magellan. Unfortunately, as soon as they did so, the winds basically turned back on them and separated essentially all of the ships. They all ended up kind of going different ways from that point on. Only the Liefde and the Hoop actually made it all the way out and then up towards the rendezvous point that they had agreed on ahead of time. They were supposed to wait 28 days at this location before they ended up moving on. Well, you know, they head up there. The Liefde heads up there. Nobody shows up for 28 days other than the Hoop, and they decide, you know what? Okay, we've got to make a decision here. They could be gone, dead, we don't know. What actually happened to those other ships is, now I'm going to butcher these names, I am so sorry about that, but the Geloof would return to Europe safely, and that would be the only ship that would return to Europe safely. The Trouw, one of the other ships, would be captured, but ultimately actually reached Tidore in kind of the Indonesia type area. They actually made it across the Pacific themselves, just the southern half. And the name that I'm just going to butcher the most here, the Blijdsboodschap, would surrender to the Spanish, and they were actually taken kind of near what is currently Lima, Peru, kind of along the coastline, that area. They were captured. So November 1599, the Liefde and the Hoop meet up at Santa Maria Island off of the coast of Chile. And they decided there, you know what, we're going to head for Japan. We're the only two ships left, and we just need to make this happen. Well, the funny thing is, before they had reached there, they had actually landed on the mainland before they reached the island, and they had a few more fights with the natives that they ran across there. They initially seemed to be friendly. They later turned out to not be friendly, and quite a few men died in some battles with them down, there in that part of Chile. William Adams' brother actually died in one of these battles. And here's possibly the weirdest part of their entire voyage. These two ships, we don't know exactly where, but we have latitude numbers from the letters of William Adams. It is believed, ran across the islands of Hawaii on their way to Japan. And the weirdest thing is they actually took a native Hawaiian from the islands. They took one on board with them. That Hawaiian ended up on the Hoop, not the Liefde. The Hoop is the ship that would later sink in a typhoon. And so if it weren't for that fact, a Hawaiian would have made it to Japan with the rest of this entire crew, which is kind of crazy to think about. What did actually end up happening was there were a few men who jumped overboard and decided, we're done with this whole journey. This Hawaii place looks great. We're staying here. They took at least one of the little side ships, a sloop, off to the islands. And what William writes is funny because he basically says, those islands were full of cannibals, so they were eaten by cannibals and they're gone. The craziest thing is that in the 1800s, there was a man who kind of went around Hawaii gathering oral traditions, recording stories. And there are stories that corroborate the time period of when this is believed to have happened. These men showed up, and those stories actually say that those men were kind of taken in and given somewhat honorary positions in Hawaiian society. They got married and integrated into the culture. So it's kind of crazy to think that not only did William end up in a position of honor in Japan, but some of these men who abandoned the ship in Hawaii actually possibly ended up in positions of honor themselves. So February 23rd, 1600, they're hit by a typhoon. And the two ships, they get separated, they lose track of each other, and all we know is that the Liefde made it to Japan, and the Hoop there is no more record of. Now, the sad thing is the Hoop, it was actually the bigger ship. It was the flagship of the entire expedition. So what this means is that the more impressive ship is not the one that necessarily made it to Japan. While the Japanese were really impressed with the Liefde, they would have been blown away with the Hoop because it was supposedly twice the size. It's believed that the reason that the Hoop sank and the Liefde did not is because the Hoop was so big and they had so few men alive able to man the ship that they weren't able to man it effectively in the storm, and that's why it sank. The Liefde, being a smaller ship, actually survived because they had enough hands to maneuver the ship the way they needed to. So in April of 1600, finally, the Liefde reaches Japan. And it's funny to see what William had to write about it. Basically, he's saying that they wish that they could have died before they even got there. So at this point, there were only 24 men alive on the ship. They had left Europe with 110 men on that specific ship. William himself actually started out the journey on a different ship entirely, and he ended up transferring to the Liefde. Otherwise, he wouldn't have even made it himself. This is kind of crazy to think that 24 men made it to what there was supposed to be their primary destination, out of 501 men who had left from Europe. So this was just a really, really rough journey for them. So by this point in time, the Japanese were used to Europeans showing up in Japan, and they always showed up in the south. They always showed up in Kyushu, the South Island of Japan. And it's funny to hear the Japanese talk about this because they had a name for Europeans at this point in time. They called them Anabon, and that means Southern Barbarian. To them, Europeans always came from the South. And so that was the name that they gave to them. And that was the same for William Adams. Even though he had come a different way than everyone else had, he still came into the southern part of Japan. So he was a Anabon to them. So I'm just going to read a little bit of when William was actually taken in to speak to Tokugawa Ieyasu and how some of that interaction actually went down. So William writes, "He made many signs unto me, some of which I understood, and some I did not. In the end, there came one who could speak Portuguese. By him, the king demanded of me of what land I was and what moved us to come to his land, being so far off. I showed unto him the name of our country, and that our land had long sought out the East Indies, and desired friendship with all kings and potentates in way of merchandise, having in our land diverse commodities which these lands had not, and also to buy such merchandises in this land which our country had not. Then he asked whether our country had wars. I answered him, yea, with the Spaniards and Portugals, being in peace with all other nations. Further, he asked me, in what did I believe? I said, in God that made heaven and earth. He asked me diverse other questions and things of religion and many other things, as what way we came to the country. Having a chart of the whole world, I showed him through the Strait of Magellan, at which he wondered and thought me to lie. Thus, from one thing to another, I abode with him until midnight. I love the fact that Tokugawa Ieyasu did not believe him when he said that this is how I got there. I felt the same way, however, when I saw this is the path he took. Now, here's the interesting thing. As I was researching this, I quickly realized there are no good maps. There are no accurate maps of William Adams' entire journey. In fact, even what they show in the video game Nioh in the opening cutscene is incorrect. They're showing ships sinking and stuff happening before, and not the path that they actually took. So I thought, you know what the heck? I've made a map that is, to as best as I can tell, exactly where the ships went, the exact path that they took all the way to Japan, at least for the Liefde. So I've included it in a link in the description below. That's something you guys can check out if you're interested in it. I just thought, you know what? Nobody else has put this on the internet. It doesn't exist. I found another map that was wrong. So, have at it. It's right down there if you're interested enough to check it out. Something I do want to mention is that when I was researching this, I quickly found that the Wikipedia page for William Adams has a lot of things that are incorrect. One of those being that they met up at some islands around the Galapagos Islands before they decided to head on to Japan. That did not happen. That is not where they met up. They met at Santa Maria Island, which is far farther south than that. It's interesting how much misinformation about William Adams there is floating around. So we talk about William Adams being made a samurai and what that might possibly mean. Now, the reality is that at this point in time, samurai was essentially really just a class. It did not necessarily mean that you were a warrior who went out and fought people with a sword all the time. It meant that generally you had a sword, but the real thing was just the privilege of the class of samurai. Interestingly enough, most of the beliefs that we currently attribute to samurai from this period in time were actually created in the 1800s, kind of in retrospect, in times of peace, when there were no wars and the samurai essentially had no true purpose at this point in time. So what was William Adams given by Ieyasu? Well, initially, he was given, along with the other shipmates, kind of a stipend and a person who managed the fund for them. They were commanded from Osaka to sail on over to Edo at the time. And that's kind of where they ended up sticking it out. Aside for some other journeys that William Adams did end up taking, trade journeys down to Okinawa and other areas down towards the south of Japan, he really kind of stuck out in this area. He ended up getting, his estate was in that area. Part of his job appeared to have been dealing with a lot of the commerce and the ships that would end up coming into the harbor up there. So one of the biggest gifts that William was given from Ieyasu was his land, essentially. I mean, land has always been important in human history. It was no less so in Japan at this point in time. He was awarded what's considered to be 250 koku. Now, a koku is, one koku is supposed to be enough rice to feed one person for an entire year. So it's kind of a useful measure that way. So it's theoretically he had enough land to feed 250 people for one entire year. That sounds like a lot, but the reality is that it wasn't. So just for reference, William himself with his 250 koku, which was roughly 100 farms that he had there. So Tokugawa Ieyasu had 4.2 million koku himself. So 250 koku, 4.2 million koku, not really that great. The rest of the daimyo of Japan together controlled 2.6 million koku themselves. And what would end up being determined for the imperial royal family, what the emperor would end up getting out of all of this, after the Battle of Sekigahara and after Ieyasu was declared shogun, the imperial family was granted 141,151 koku. So, yeah, I mean, it was great that he got 250 koku. He was definitely not not doing poorly for himself. But, you know, you can see the difference there socially. If you're just counting the straight numbers, he had some land. He did not have a lot. The class of Hatamoto that he was granted was technically just a step down to where he could have a personal audience with the shogun almost whenever he wanted. But the land he actually controlled, the title he held, and the whole idea of him being a samurai is a little bit over-exaggerated given what we currently think of samurai as being. One interesting thing to note is that because William Adams had studied essentially as a shipbuilder as well as a navigator in England, he was able to convey a lot of this information to Tokugawa Ieyasu. He actually taught him geometry, mathematics, all kinds of other information that he had, and he was just blowing Ieyasu's mind. Ieyasu asked him, please, I want you to build a ship. He commissioned him to build a ship. William told him, I can't do that great of a job at shipbuilding, but sure, what the heck. Ieyasu ended up being so floored by the ship that William built that he's like, this is what we're doing. We're building ships like this from now on. So that really helped to revolutionize Japan's naval capabilities at that point in time, which only did more to, you know, further solidify Ieyasu's position in Japanese society. One final point that I wanted to make is that the persecution of Christians in Japan had already been going on before William Adams showed up. Obviously, it was a new thing. There were people who didn't like it, who didn't respond well to it. But because of some information that William Adams provided, like we talked about in the video, it kind of expedited the process of realizing, like, we don't need to tolerate Christianity anymore. And Christians were really, I mean, even before William Adams died, they were being rounded up on quite a regular basis and being killed. So this wasn't entirely because of what William Adams did. However, what William Adams' presence meant was something Ieyasu interpreted as being, hey, we don't have to tolerate this anymore. This isn't the only way to obtain what we want to from the Europeans. What ultimately did happen, however, is that the Dutch were the only ones from Europe that were allowed to trade with Japan for a couple hundred years. And the crazy thing is that all of European studies and learning in anatomy and science and medicine and everything was studied by the Japanese periodically. They had people who specialized in that so they could keep up on what was going on because they knew they were closed off, but they didn't want to be left behind. And those studies were actually referred to by the Japanese as Dutch studies. So all of what was going on in Europe at the time in Japan fell under the category of Dutch. This is what the Dutch are doing. And so it's interesting to see there's a lot of words in Japanese that came into Japanese at this point in time, specifically when the Portuguese showed up. For example, in Japanese, the word for bread is pan. And I mean, anyone who speaks any Romance language immediately recognizes that word. There's a lot of words like that came across. The Japanese are very good at adopting words from other languages, and that period of time was no exception. So guys, that's a ton of information. Believe it or not, that's like still not even everything that I have, but we just have to cut it off here. If you have more, you know, that you want to learn about this, I've got some really good resources for you. Specifically, the notes for all the research that I did are in a link in the description. So go ahead and check that out and ask any questions that you want to in the comments below. We'd really appreciate that. These videos are so much fun to make, but they take so much time and so much effort, and it would mean so much to us if you were to find a way to either share our videos with people that you know who might enjoy them, or even if you feel so inclined, donating to our Patreon campaign that we've launched recently. We really appreciate you guys watching all the stuff that we make. It means so much to us, and we've had so much fun growing this channel, and we hope to see you guys again next time.